Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and this is my wrap-up for April. I'm a little bit late this month, but it's been a really busy time with work and studies at the moment, so apologies for that, but I have got 4 books to talk about today, which is almost as many as I'm supposed to be reading each month. That reading goal is moving further and further away, but never mind that. Let's get started with my usual small booktuber shoutouts, and I normally shout out 3 booktubers with under 500 subscribers that I've been particularly enjoying this month. However, in April, I really didn't get to watch much booktube, so unfortunately I only have 2 booktubers that I want to shout out. I really do hope that you check them both out though. The first channel I want to shout out is the Zurich Review, and I'm so glad that I actually get to say that because Karin, who runs the channel from Switzerland, has been away from booktube for many months. We actually started our channels around about the same time, but then she took quite some time off booktube, but now she is back. Karin reads very different genres, some adult fiction, some young adult fiction, some genre fiction, some literary fiction, really all sorts of books. But what I enjoy about her channel is that she occasionally reviews Swiss and German books, which are, you know, the kind of books that I just don't hear about as much on booktube. The second channel I want to give a shout out to is Yaita Ganopoli, who has recently shifted the focus of her channel from more of a traditional booktube channel to a channel that combines book content and tech content. So she's planning to do some techie tutorials about things like design, web design and editing with a bookish twist, and I'm so excited about that. I am not knowledgeable enough to look at pure tech tutorials, but putting that bookish twist on it makes me really interested in learning some of those skills. She's only recently switched to that, so I'm really looking forward to her new content and seeing this very unique take on a booktube channel. Both channels are of course linked in the description box. I suggest you go and check them out. Let's get to the books then. In April I read 4 books with an average rating of 4.25 stars. Yes, you heard that correctly, 4.25 stars. So there have been some amazing reads for me this month. And a bit of a theme of dystopian fiction. Before we get into the reviews, let me just remind you that you can find timestamps for this video in the description box, so you can jump to a specific review that you're interested in, and there are also links to Amazon where you can buy those books if you're interested. Now bear in mind those are affiliate links, so just so you're aware, if you click on those links and then buy the books, I will get a small commission from that. The first book I finished in April was Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, and this is her Pulitzer Prize winning novel from 2004, and I've been reading this on and off since February. It took me a surprising amount of time to finish this book, but even though it's not a particularly long book. It's the pace and the style of the narration more than anything that makes it so slow to read, and this is a book that just can't be rushed. The story's set in the 1950s and it's basically the memoir or a kind of a diary written by an aging American priest in the form of a long letter to his young son. This priest is called John Ames, and he's old and ill and knows that he's nearing the end of his life. He has a wife who's much younger than him and a son who's only about 10 at the beginning of the book, and the whole narrative is a long letter to this 10-year-old son. This book doesn't really have a plot, and that's fine. We get stories about John Ames himself, his childhood, his father, his grandfather, and his life now as an old man. But woven into these ruminations is a very subtle commentary on American 19th and early 20th century history and society. And since I read this from a European perspective, not knowing all that much about American history, I'm pretty sure a lot of it went completely over my head, but I'm sure American readers will get a lot more out of this context. There is also heavy discussion of religion and faith in this book, which makes sense since the main character is a priest who likes to discuss theology extensively. That's not really my thing, but the beautiful writing of the story made me continue through the book despite these religious passages. Generally, it was the writing that made this book quite special. There is barely any plot to keep you going, the dialogue is absolutely minimal. Really, we are spending the entire book inside of the head of an aging American preacher, and it is a high compliment to Marilynne Robinson that she made this character so fascinating to read about. His thoughts are really beautifully put into words, and for me that was enough to keep my interest. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, but it was certainly not an easy read. The second book I finished was The Children of Men by P.D. James, which I listened to on audiobook. This is a dystopian novel from 1992, but it's set in what seemed like the future then, but is almost the present now, the year 2021. People might be familiar with the film adaptation of this book, but I haven't actually seen the film, so I can't compare the two. The story follows Dr. Theodore Farron, who is a middle-aged history lecturer at Oxford University, and he lives in a world completely without children, since the human race went infertile all the way back in 1994. That means that the youngest people alive in the story are 27. The population of the UK and the world is declining, and there is a general feeling of depression and helplessness in the air. The government has been overthrown by a tyrannic ruler who happens to be Theo's cousin, and he runs the country with the usual dystopian mix of surveillance and fear. Theo accidentally gets involved with a small resistance group based in Oxford, which includes a young woman named Julian. But things really kick off when she finds out that she is pregnant. Remember, there hasn't been a pregnancy in 27 years, and Theo and the other members of the group try their best to keep her safe and to keep her secret. This was a very interesting read. You might have picked up on some of the themes of the book just from my summary. Religion is a really big one. Christian religion in particular. There's a miraculously pregnant woman pursued by an evil ruler. Her unborn child is the only hope for the salvation of the world. You get the parallels. Religion is also discussed in great detail in the book, with the question of its purpose in a world completely without hope. One striking but also kind of funny tidbit, for example, is that desperate couples in the books will raise kittens like they are human children, even going so far as to have them christened in a church. Imagine that, treating cats like children. The plot of this book kind of meanders along with lengthy discussions on politics, society, human behaviour, and general philosophical concepts before the plot really picks up. For about 3/4 of the book, nothing much happens, but it ends in quite a violent and action-packed sequence. I didn't mind that. I like slow books, but that's something you might want to know before diving into this book yourself. The only other criticism I have is the writing itself, specifically the use of perspective. The novel starts with a diary entry written by Theo himself, and that keeps going for a few chapters before the narrative switches to a limited third-person perspective, which is still following Theo and still following his thoughts. Throughout the book, it switches back and forth between the diary and the third-person narrative, and I don't quite see the point in those switches. There isn't any kind of regularity, and there isn't any real change in perspective. I would have found it much more cohesive if the story had stuck to either the diary or the third-person narrative. Other than that, great story, very unusual kind of dystopian novel. I enjoyed it a lot, and I gave it 4 stars. The third book I finished in April was a true classic of dystopian fiction, 1984 by George Orwell, which was published in 1949. I also listened to the audiobook of this, but now I wish I'd bought a paper copy instead, because there were so many things that I really wanted to highlight and underline in this novel, which is usually not my style at all. I'm sure most of you will have either read or heard about the story, so I'll keep the plot summary to a minimum. The year is, you guessed it, 1984, and Winston Smith is just a normal guy working for the Ministry of Truth in London. The Ministry of Truth? Why yes, this is a dystopian society that has sprung up after the Second World War, complete with oppressive totalitarian governments, surveillance, torture, and an endless war, which serves the only purpose of keeping population under control. But Winston himself is a thought criminal. He is critical of the government, of the party, and of Big Brother, who is the party's figurehead. He is only critical inside of his mind, though he dare not speak out, but that is enough to make him a target. He meets a woman named Julia, and together they try to break free from the constraints of their society. I'm going to be honest, I approached this book with quite a cynical attitude. I was mainly interested in its function as a dystopian classic, meaning I wanted to explore the origins of many of the common dystopian tropes. And I found a lot of them, of course, the policing of thought and identity, for example, of language, the forced and rigid societal structures, the friendly face of a government that rules through fear and violence. All of these structures are ones that we find in dystopian fiction over and over again. But of course, this hasn't just sprung from George Orwell's imagination. He copied these structures and methods from totalitarian governments that he had experienced during his lifetime. And that's exactly why this book is so terrifying and scary. The technology itself is, from our 21st century perspective, pretty standard, pretty commonplace. Screens in every home, for example, that function simultaneously as entertainment for the masses, as communication devices, and as instruments of surveillance. This anyone? Or the state-run rewriting of history, spinning the facts to suit the politics, of twisting events so that it looks like people made a decision when in fact they were manipulated into it without realizing it. Okay, I'm not the first one to draw parallels between this 1940s novel and current events, and it's no surprise that this book became wildly popular again in January of 2017. But it surprised me how much of this book is applicable to my own life. I did not expect to identify with the people in the story, and it shocked me that I did. Again, I came to this from a very cynical point of view. I expected a historical document showing an early masterpiece of dystopian fiction, and I certainly got that. But I also got a novel that is just as terrifying to read today as it would have been decades ago. Even if we look beyond the relatability and significance of this novel, the story itself is a true masterpiece. The characters are amazing. Both Winston and Julia are just unlikable enough to be realistic. Definitely not your typical literary heroes, and yet their circumstances make them objects of your empathy in a way that's kind of messed with my head as I was reading the book. The setting is incredibly intricate and described in great detail, and that is something that I can imagine some readers not enjoying a whole lot, because sometimes it feels like an academic discussion rather than a true narrative. But I still got a lot out of that sometimes rather dry discourse and description of the world. The plot itself is very well thought out and executed, and the last part of the book in particular was very hard to read because it's so impactful. The descriptions of violence and manipulation are incredibly vivid, and there were moments when I had to stop the audiobook and just take a little bit of a break from the book before I got back to it. Anyway, I could talk about this book for hours. If you haven't figured it out by now, this is a straight up 5-star read for me. The first one in 2019, and definitely one of the best books that I have read recently. By now I'm on a dystopian roll, so the last book I read in April was The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. This is a young adult dystopian adventure novel from 2008, and I'm sure you've all at least heard of it. In 2008, I already loved dystopian fiction, so I'm not sure why I didn't read The Hunger Games back then. But when I saw a copy in a local charity shop, I thought I should probably catch up, and I'm glad that I did. I actually recorded my reaction while reading the book in a separate video, which you can find linked up here. That video already has all of my thoughts on the book, so this review is going to be a little bit shorter. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on the book, definitely check out this very heavily spoilery video that I made on that. The Hunger Games is set in the far future of America, where the country, now named Panem, is ruled by a centralized government in the capital. The capital is the home of the ruling classes, living a life of luxury and decadence, and it's surrounded by 12 districts with much poorer populations who provide the goods and services for the country. Every year, 2 teenagers from those districts are randomly selected by lottery to be taken to a big outdoor arena and fight to the death in a ritual called the Hunger Games. Our main character, Katniss, is from District 12 and ends up, you guessed it, fighting in the Hunger Games. Now I'm going to leave the summary there in case you too have been living under the same rock that I only recently crawled out from. I enjoyed this book. I know I shouldn't say this about a story that involves children murdering other children, but after 1984, this felt like a surprisingly light read. And I think that's because Susan Collins managed to intersperse the whole children murdering children premise with a good dose of humour, of romance, and of world building. I wasn't the biggest fan of the romance in this book, but it was done in an unusual and plot-relevant way. I was, however, a big fan of the world building, and that's mainly why I want to continue reading this book series. The main character, Katniss, was also really well written, which is important because this is a first-person, present tense narrative, so throughout the whole book we are seeing the world through her eyes. She has a very refreshing kind of confidence about her that I enjoyed. Even though she is thrown into all sorts of new situations, she's always aware of her strengths and of her weaknesses and trying to work around her weaknesses and utilize her strengths. For my taste, there was a little bit too much of a focus on the action-adventure aspect of the story and not enough on the world building and character development. But I'm pretty sure that will be expanded on in the other 2 books in this series. Very enjoyable read and another 4 stars from me. Thank you to all of you who have recommended I watch the film after I posted my original video on the Hunger Games. I have since done that and I enjoyed that very much. I think it's a really good adaptation and I probably enjoyed the film a little bit more than the book even. And this was it for my April wrap-up. Let's just quickly go through my curated bookshelf tally. That's always where I keep myself accountable at the end of the month to make sure I don't hold on to too many books because I have limited shelf space. Now 2 of the 4 books I read this month were audiobooks and 2 were paperbacks. Both paperbacks I am going to hold on to, so I'm going to have to find some space on my bookshelf for those. And now let's get on to my non-book favourite of the month, which is something that I'm pretty sure I'm the only BookTube community member who enjoys it, and that is Magic the Gathering. There has been the release of a fantastic new set in April, and that is why I spent the latter half of the month playing Magic games, both in person and on the laptop, rather than reading books. War of the Spark, which is the name of the new expansion, is amazing. It is incredibly intricate, it's super fun to play, and I have been enjoying it a lot. And that was it. I am a little bit slow in my BookTube creation process at the moment because, well, my life is quite busy at the moment, and unfortunately I can't quite devote as much time to BookTube as I would like. Hopefully I'll get back to doing, 2-3 videos a week again. I really love creating the content. At the moment that's not possible, but I should be able to do at least 1 video a week anyway. Thank you for watching. Bye!